Okay, this is something I've been excited to do for most of this week because there's no one better to talk about politics, about stories of the day, about what's happening with the presidential history being created as we live through it, than former KGO talk show host John Rothmann. So welcome, John Rothmann, to the broadcast. Hi.
Thank you, Kim. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
How you doing?
I'm great. There certainly is a lot that we're going to have to talk about. There's so much going on, and I can't wait.
There is a lot to talk about, John Rothmann. Did you, first of all, because I haven't talked to you about this yet at all, what's your, kind of give us the lay of the land about what you think of the indictments?
Well, I have to tell you, it was long overdue. There was no doubt in my mind that there would be an indictment. I worked for Richard Nixon. I understand the nature of the presidency. And what Donald Trump did was just irresponsible. And you'll notice that a number of key Republicans, although they aren't opposing Trump, are saying what he did was wrong. And I think that's critical to national security. This was a disaster. Last night, I had a choice, as we all do, as to what we listen to and what we read, whether I should listen to CNN, which had a fascinating discussion, including John Dean, about history, or whether I should listen to Fox, which carried Donald Trump's presentation at Mar-a-Lago. I chose to listen to Donald Trump. I was so appalled by the inaccuracies, it's almost beyond comprehension. What's even more beyond comprehension, and it goes to the very heart of your question about reacting, is the total lack of reaction, the lack of horror by Republicans. I couldn't help but think if there were a Democrat in the White House who had done what Donald Trump has done, they would be up in arms. And it's that double standard that bothers me. Oh, wait, double standard? We're talking about Biden, and we're talking about Hunter Biden, rather, and we're talking about Hillary Clinton, and a double standard. It's completely different. There is no analogy between what this president did and what was done in the case of Hillary Clinton or Hunter Biden, who, by the way, and those of you who've listened to me for a long time on KGO and other sources, know I was vigorous in my feeling that they should be investigated. And I would remind you, the Trump Justice Department did not prosecute either Hunter Biden or Hillary Clinton.
After multiple investigations. I mean,
Yeah.
They tried. They looked into it. They didn't find anything they could charge them with, right?
Yep. And so as when you make the suggestion, as you did earlier, you had that business from Fox about dictatorship and so forth. If nothing could be further from the truth. But what bothers me is the blindness of Republicans to the tragedy that is unfolding in this country. We really are in the midst of a different kind of constitutional crisis, and it goes to the heart of who we are as Americans.
Let's get into what you saw last night, because I had a hard time finding video of what was said at Bedminster Club in New Jersey by former President Trump last night. And I think that's responsible journalism, because I don't think that it's good to publish lies. But let's get into it.
Hold on before you go on. I think it's important to listen to them. Otherwise, how do you know they're lies?
That's right.
That's why I chose last night to listen to Fox instead of CNN. Because if people could hear what Donald Trump said, and then it could be criticized, I think it would be bigger. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I agree. I was talking to Jim Avila, formerly with ABC, this week, and he was talking about the best ways in which to cover Trump. And what he was saying is it's irresponsible to let him speak live anymore, because you know he's going to say things that are lies. So the best way to do it is to take the video, play some, stop it, report on what was true and what was not true, play some more, report on what's true and what's not true, so people really get an accurate accounting. Because when you just roll the tape, roll the video live and let the lies spew forth, sometimes as evidence, people can't tell, fact from fiction. So
it's better that way, Kim.
I don't know.
That way, no one can be accused of censorship or of distorting what someone says. I believe that. I think it's true. You were talking about AI earlier.
Right.
You've got to have it off the bark, if you will. That's my view.
I just feel like when you let it roll without stopping, without calling attention to it, we see what people believe, and what they believe are anything that he comes out of his mouth, they'll drink it right up.
The key word that you said is fact check. As soon as the tape runs, there needs to be a fact check.
Yeah.
And that's what should have happened. The distortions about the presidential act the President Papers Act was unbelievable. He was completely wrong. His announcement that he's going to go after Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and their crime family, if you will, absolutely need to be heard. The fact that he was ready to unleash the Trump Justice Department to get them. I mean, you have to hear it. It has to be understood. And it should scare the living bejeebers out of us, because when you have a president who ignores the law, he has to be called to account. So anyway, let's talk
about the lies from last night. What are some of the big whoppers that stood out to you?
Well, the president doesn't own the papers. These papers, according to the act, are owned by the federal government. They are not the president's boxes, nor are they the president's papers. And that needs to be understood very clearly. Number two, and most critically, when a former president of the United States talks about going back into office and weaponizing the Department of Justice, it's horrible. And when he said that Joe Biden is the most dishonest president, the most crooked president we've ever had, I'm scratching my head and I'm saying he certainly doesn't know his history. But there were so many distortions in the course of what Donald Trump said. But you see, that's why I listened to it. If I had not listened to it and you had asked me the question, I could not have answered the question. And so I think it is the responsible thing to do, to play it and critique it. By the way, that's been done with many presidents, and it should be the process that we follow. What is particularly disturbing to me is the Republicans in the United States Senate, the leadership, have really been silent on all of this. Maybe they're just holding their fire. But when I hear the Republicans in the House of Representatives, like Speaker McCarthy, making the kind of comments they're making, I find it indefensible. It is. What is even more disturbing to me is that it's acceptable to a broad range of Americans, and that's even worse.
It's a shocker. I was reading another story on CNN last night, and the headline is Trump's main 2024 election goal now is to save himself. That this whole candidacy, maybe instead of an effort to really become president again, maybe just really part of a legal defense. Because if I'm a candidate, then I can say I'm being persecuted.
But he's been running since he lost the last election. I think there is a plus, as you point out, and rightly so, that a president of the United States can pardon himself. And Donald Trump is indicating, I think, that that's precisely what he's going to do. And I think that is the key here. He would have run anyway. This is just an added layer of protection, which happened to go his way. What is he going to do when and this is, I didn't mention this, but I want to, John Smith, who is the independent counsel on all of this, he's called him a lunatic. He's called him a right-wing nut. He's called him, every conceivable name that could be called. And yet Smith has a stellar reputation. He's won some, he's lost some, but he's prepared his case. And I really think people who are listening to this broadcast should Google the document charging Donald Trump. It's not very long. It's very clear. It's very precise. Have you heard a single Republican try to refute the charges, all 37 of them, line by line? And the answer is no. And the reason is because there is no defense for what Donald Trump did. So my expectation is that there will be another indictment. Not only from Georgia, which we can talk about later if you'd like, but also from the facts about January 6th. And that is, to me, as devastating, if not more devastating.
Right.
So this is just the beginning of Donald Trump's legal problems, but it also leads us back to the great question I've been posing, and that is the future of the Republican Party. Kim, I've been called a scholar of modern republicanism. When people write histories of the Republican Party, I generally get a call asking me for my view of the manuscript or what they're writing. I want a two-party system in this country. And if, as Donald Trump Jr. said on the ellipse on January 6th, it is no longer the Republican Party, it is the party of Trump, this country is in deep trouble. Because the minute you have one-party government, you're in trouble. And that's the problem here in California, too. We have the Democrats in control of the governorship, every constitutional office, plus both houses of the state legislature. It's not healthy. It's not good. You want to have a competitive argument. And that's why, if I may be so bold as to say, Sean Hannity's interview with Gavin Newsom was well worth listening to. It was well
really
worth having that confrontation. And
Absolutely.
I thought Gavin Newsom, about whom I've had many criticisms over the years, did a splendid job of dealing with Sean Hannity. And so all of these factors play in, and it's going to be an even more intense debate. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out you have two members of the United States Senate who are playing games now in a way which I think is just inexcusable.
J.D. Vance, one of them, right?
Yep. J.D. Vance of Ohio, freshman senator, who owes his election to Donald Trump, and who succeeded, by the way, Senator Portman, who is a Republican who I had great respect for. J.D. Vance, who is saying he's going to put a hold on anything that Merrick Garland wants to get done. It is absolutely, talk about an obstruction. I'm being very careful in my words, an obstructive justice. That is the Justice Department. There you have it. And then you have Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, who is also a freshman senator, who has held up 250 requests by the Department of Defense for promotions, for retirements, for all sorts of things because of their policy dealing with abortion. When you have two senators with that kind of power, the United States Senate ought to take a hard look at what's going on because they write their own rules. But this is the kind of extremism within the Republican Party today that should terrify every American, pure and simple.
So you mentioned history, your love of history. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is another story I was reading last night. And the headline, I think it was from newjersey.net, was that former President Trump is not the first president to seek what they called refuge in New Jersey. And they mentioned Nixon. And so I thought, what a perfect question to talk about with you to see what does New Jersey have. But before we do that, let me pop in and see what Albert's up with. What's up with Albert?
Yeah, John, can you just disconnect and reconnect to the stream? I think your microphone is sounding a little tinny. So just
okay.
So just
Hold
leave
on.
it as...
Yes.
Okay, we'll do that. And while we do, we'll talk about a little bit more about
Albert,
some
is
of
this better?
No, you're gonna have to leave the studio.
Leave the studio
and,
completely?
just...
leave it and come
God,
back. Yeah.
normally people ask me to leave the studio because of something I said. So, okay. All right. I got to figure out how to do it, but I'll do it.
Oh, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump while John Rothman disconnects and reconnects. I tend to think, and I miss maybe where I differ with John Rothman, that I can kind of see the writing on the wall, much like Trump laid the groundwork for the big lie by months and months and months and months ahead of time before the election, saying, if I lose, it's because they cheated. If I lose, it's because there's shenanigans. If I lose, they did something. He knew what was coming, or even if he didn't, it was a great, way to, if he did lose, turn around and blame. He knew what he was going to do ahead of time. And just like that, I feel like the candidacy for president offers the same thing. A presidential run by Donald Trump, in my opinion, is laying the groundwork for him to turn around and blame his candidacy or blame everyone for persecuting him because he's a candidate. I think it's common sense. You've seen him lay the groundwork again and again and again, and this candidacy is just another notion of that. That's what I think, John Rothman.
Well, you're right, but he would have run anyway. That's the key. He was planning to run. He's been raising money to run. But you're right. It's another layer on what has become a remarkable moment. By the way, if you heard Mike Pence this morning, he is now being more critical of Donald Trump. So You're now seeing
Finally.
some Republicans who are lining up. They're all being careful, and they're not being careful about not only Donald Trump, they're being careful about Trump voters, because they know that if they attack Trump head on, they lose his votes, and if they lose his votes, they can't win the presidency.
You know who's not being careful, though, is Chris Christie.
Yeah. He has nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Chris Christie
I mean,
is he's not going to be the nominee, but he intends to do everything he can, because frankly, he's very angry at Donald Trump, not only on policy, but because Donald Trump gave him COVID and then tried to deny it. I mean, it's a whole question.
So let's go back to the question about New Jersey and presidents heading that way after they've, seen a mountain of trouble. Is there anything to that, or is there anything important about noting it?
No, nothing. Nixon moved from California, from San Clemente. He first went to New York, and then when he decided, really in his own sense, he wanted to be in a different place, he went to New Jersey, and he settled in, but there was no real connection. We have had a remarkable number of incidents, political incidents out of New Jersey, including Weehawken, New Jersey, where the famous duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton took place. Remember, Woodrow Wilson came from New Jersey. I mean, you can go down a whole list of fascinating comments about New Jersey, but no particular significance.
So we saw in the Trump presidency how divisive he is and was for America, how a middle ground of kind of people who straddled the middle line between, I could vote Republican, I could vote Democrat, maybe I'm conservative fiscally, but socially I'm more liberal, that the kind of the divide between the two sides widened. And I wonder if this is what we're going to see, because there's a headline I was seeing as well that said the defiance of former President Trump hints at another divisive spectacle ahead of us, that on CNN. So is this just something else that pushes us farther apart that we don't need?
I have to answer you very clearly. We've had a divisiveness in politics for years. I'll just use a few examples. Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky. Remember the divide between Democrats and Republicans?
Yep.
Certainly, we had a huge divide with George W. Bush.
But let's go back to Clinton, because
Sure.
Democrats even were like, that's wrong. What he did was wrong.
But
right?
they stuck with him. They stuck with him, and that is the reason why he was not removed from office.
Yeah.
When Byrd and Feinstein and Moynihan and Kerry, Bob Kerry of Nebraska, stuck with him, he was able to survive. But there was a deep division, and the bitterness was incredibly strong. And certainly in the case of George W. Bush, the divisions were real. And I would suggest to you that with Barack Obama, talk about divisiveness. Donald Trump and some Republicans went so far as to say he wasn't even qualified for the presidency because he wasn't a citizen of the United States, because he was not born here. Remember that? No. This is now not the politics of constructive debate. It is the politics of destruction. And that is the goal that unfortunately has been assumed. And I think it's a genuine tragedy for America. I believe in dialogue and discussion and debate, and certainly not the politics of destruction.
You have said in the past that you don't think Donald Trump will go to jail. I would enjoy seeing him go to jail. I know a lot of
what
people,
you'd enjoy is seeing him convicted.
I'll both.
Okay.
I have a vision of an orange jumpsuit and a guy behind bars. I don't know how that works with the Secret Service. Like, there's so many things that you would have to think about. Yeah. In my fantasy, he's, because of everything he's done to America, because of how rotten he's been for this country, because of what he's put us through, he's in jail. He's a criminal. Okay.
The answer is,
you say he's not going. You
maintain
go to jail.
This? He ultimately would be given clemency, which is what Eugene V. Debs was given in 1921.
Even if it's a Democrat in office?
Come again?
Even if it's a Democrat in office?
Oh, yes. It was a Republican who granted clemency to a socialist who got almost a million votes for president in 1920. I'm not a vindictive person, Kim. What I want is history to record what happened. And that was the case with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon broke every norm, obstructed justice. What he did was appalling. But Gerald Ford did the right thing in saying to him, admit your guilt, which Nixon did in a statement. And it was enough to get him a pardon. And I'm glad. I think Donald Trump is in the same category. The politics of personal vengeance is less important in my judgment. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe our listeners will disagree with me and will tell us that. It is how history judges it. And I believe, and many of you have heard my broadcasts around President's Day when we deal with this question, that Donald Trump will rank as the worst president in the history of the United States. He's going to beat James Buchanan in that regard.
That's saying something.
And because it's just unethical. It's wrong. Can you imagine if a Democrat in the White House had violated all of the national security provisions and then tried to cover up, actually talk to his lawyer about, covering up certain? This is astounding. I'll tell you what I hope. This is what I'm worried about. When this all comes to court, the Trump people are going to move attorney-client privilege, and they're going to try to get Trump's lawyers' testimony knocked out. And I hope to God that doesn't happen, because John Dean is the best example. John Dean was the counsel to the President of the United States. He went to the prosecutors and told them the truth. Now, a lot of people in the Nixon circle said that was snitching. No, it wasn't. It wasn't snitching. It was right. And the same thing applies now with Trump's lawyers. They are coming forward. They are telling the truth. And that's Donald Trump's great failure. So we have also his voice on tape, although I haven't heard that particular tape, but we've heard his on Georgia. We've heard him in the Georgia case. How do you deny what you did to try to obstruct American democracy?
Which is why it's frustrating that it's taken so long.
But it's okay that it takes long. It took long in Watergate. Yeah. It took more than 2 years between the Watergate break-in and Nixon's resignation. That's how long it takes to build a case. The last thing you want is for a case to be brought which isn't valid or which doesn't have legs. The most important single thing is, have you heard a Republican say that the charges being brought against Donald Trump are wrong? Have you heard a single Republican, even his staunchest allies, say that? And the answer is no. That's the key. I see you have a lot of questions. Do you want to kick some of them out to me before our time's up?
Let's talk about what Velma has to say, because, and you talked about being a vindictive person, and I have to say I'm not usually one to wish ill will on anyone, but I stand behind wanting to see him in prison. I just do. But
okay,
I also
read what Velma said. I
also agree with Velma. She said, I'd rather see Trump never be able to run for public office and not be the head of any political party or influence our nation's politics. Is there any scenario in which we see that happening? Will he have to be charged with sedition in the January 6th case in order for him to be kicked out of candidacy and never run for president again?
He's 77 years old today. I doubt sincerely that he will ever be able to run again. And if you really want him to be prevented from running, the answer is his own voters and the American people have to say to him, enough is enough. That is the goal. And I hope, I really mean this very sincerely, and I would say this if this were a Democrat. If this were a Democrat who had done what Donald Trump did on national security, boy, oh boy, I would feel the same way. But he is his own worst enemy. None of this had to happen if he'd only been honest, if he hadn't tried to cover up. And the real charge they're going to get him on, I think, is the cover-up. That's the key.
I think honesty is pretty hard for him. Randy writes, we can't run the country based on vengeance. So let this trial of Trump run its course and be done with it. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between a pardon and clemency?
Yeah.
So
a pardon is when you say, I pardon you for what you did. Clemency simply says, you've accepted the verdict, you've been in jail, I'm now going to let you out because I have compassion. And that's what Warren Harding did for Eugene V. Debs. Warren Harding was a very conservative Republican. Eugene V. Debs was a socialist. He was convicted of sedition under the Sedition Act of 1917. And one of the things that Harding did, and he was not a great president by any stretch. Warren Harding, one of the things he wanted to do was heal the wounds of the country. And I think that is what we have to do if we can. Now, let me point out, when Trump is gone, and it will happen, he will ultimately vanish. Then the question becomes, what's his legacy? Do Republicans reclaim their party? There was no Republican platform in 2020. The Republican Party said, whatever you want, Donald Trump, that's our policy. No political party should be able to do something like that, because what we want from a political party is statements of where they stand and what they believe.
Right.
And I think that is really critical. Anyway, there are more questions, and I know we have limited time, so fire away.
Dania says Trump doesn't deserve clemency. He deserves to be treated just as a citizen. He hasn't earned the right to be treated any differently. Being a former president is a moot point. History will be okay. And I you talk about people that have been pardoned or given clemency in the past, but perhaps none of the things they have done have risen to the level of hurting America by trying to thwart democracy or trying to keep our nuclear
disagree with that.
I mean, this is prison material.
You understand, clemency is granted by the President of the United States, or, if you will, by a governor of a state, if it comes to a state issue. And that's an individual judgment. There are some people who make the argument, rightly or wrongly, that a former president of the United States should never be in jail. I believe that a former president of the United States should be convicted if he's guilty. History should stand clearly in that regard.
Yeah.
But I don't want to make him a martyr. I don't want to make him a rallying cry for his minions. When Donald Trump is gone from the stage, I don't want people saying, oh, those Democrats destroyed Donald Trump. No, Donald Trump has destroyed himself. And when he goes to court, as I hope he will, if a president, Democrat or Republican, wants to, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, bind up the nation's wounds, it'll be clemency. It won't be a pardon. No one can make an excuse for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I know many of you disagree with me. You think I'm just dead wrong, but that's my judgment about how you heal the nation's wounds. And don't you agree with me? I mean, stop and think about it, that ultimately what we want is a united States of America. And the political differences, the polarization, I hope to be set aside so we can deal with the real problems this country faces.
Or
Donald Trump is not a real problem.
Conversely, does it show that you can go ahead, run for president, and if you're elected, you can do whatever you want to do because you're never really going to have to pay the price?
No, Richard Nixon paid the price. Dick Nixon paid
by having to resign?
By having to resign, by having to accept a pardon. That was the judgment of history. He'll never recover from that. And I want Donald Trump to be, if he's guilty, and I believe he is, but we have to see the evidence. If he's convicted, let history judge him. I don't need I have no sense of personal vengeance. I think it's a great American tragedy. And when this is written about, and I hope you and I are still here in 20 or 30 years, Kim, you will be, to be able to talk about this, the judgment of history will be harsh when it comes to Donald Trump. But I want to remind all of our listeners today, when Richard Nixon resigned, 31% of the Republican Party still believed in his innocence. Yeah. The facts be damned. And I'm afraid with about 1/3 of the American people, 31%, maybe a little higher, the same thing applies with Donald Trump. They don't care what the facts are, but we have to care. And that's my point.
I think
there are other questions. Go ahead.
Well, Queen Danny is agreeing with you, saying, I think what you're saying is smart. Well, because you're John Rothman, that would follow.
Don't tell my wife that.
75 million people voted for him. So, I mean, when you look at how many people supported him, then maybe that is the only way to kind of pave over all the ugliness and give some peace to our country. I don't like it, but maybe you're right.
That's the American way. I believe those 75 million were wrong. But if you listen to Fox, and I do listen to Fox, I listened this morning to a discussion about Kamala Harris. It was the most distorted, one-sided, horrific description of Kamala and her vice presidency that one could ever imagine. But if you ask me about freedom of speech, I say yes, but let me point out, people can go too far. Look at Tucker Carlson. Look what happened to him. And I think that is, and by the way, I listened to him this morning on his podcast.
Whatever, yeah.
It's appalling. I mean, it's really appalling. But notice his numbers are falling. And eventually, the American people, most of us, will wise up to Donald Trump. When the campaign began, some of you will recall, I compared him to Elmer Gantry. And if you've never watched the trailer for the Elmer Gantry movie, I suggest that you do it, because Donald Trump is the biggest huckster who ever occupied the presidency. But ultimately, even good hucksters are exposed.
Let me just, and I know we're running over time. I'm sorry to keep
I don't mind. I have nothing to do. Ellen's away, so I'm home alone.
It's okay.
Wild parties every night, Kim.
Let's talk about the difference, though, between the two most recent presidential criminals,
Right.
allegedly. So Huge in Japan writes this about Nixon. He resigned in disgrace. He was vilified by history. That was Nixon's punishment. And I would argue that Nixon actually cared about that, cared about his legacy, cared about how he was thought of after the fact. But Joe writes, Trump doesn't give a damn about history. Trump doesn't care about how he's remembered later on. There's a difference in, I don't know, being conscious of that, I think, in this case. And I don't think you have the same type of remorse.
Okay, let me answer you directly.
Yeah.
Nixon was appalled by what happened to him. I don't think he truly grasped it. But Richard Nixon clung to the Constitution. He really did. And he understood why he had to resign. And you're right. Donald Trump won't give a damn. And that's fine, because it's not the judgment of history that Donald Trump interprets, but rather our judgment. What will my children, what will, God willing, my grandchildren, looking back, say about Donald Trump? How will history evaluate him? When I participate in rating the presidents, Bill Writing's fantastic survey, which I've done every President's Day weekend for years, that's the key. Because in the end, most people don't remember who was president 10 years ago or 20 years ago. They don't remember scandals. But the place in history is what is critical. And so I'm taking a long-term view. I can guarantee you one thing. When Richard Nixon left the presidency, every future president consulted him one way or the other. From Jimmy Carter on, they talked to him. Bill Clinton consulted him. Ronald Reagan consulted him. George Bush consulted him. Richard Nixon was respected not for the terrible damage he did to this country, but for his, in many ways, brilliance, his foreign policy expertise, his legacy. Okay, who's going to consult with Donald Trump? I want you to stop and think about it. There is no real legacy to Donald Trump that is constructive or positive that a former president would want to consult with him about. Yeah. He's a blot on the history of our country, but we have to understand why. And the future of our country, in terms of history, has to understand why. Oh, Trump will never understand, never admit. He doesn't have that capability, but we must. And if you think I sound impassioned about this, I do. I believe in the fundamental principles of American democracy. And when Benjamin Franklin said to that woman, as he came out of Constitutional Hall, it's a republic if you can keep it. Well, that to me is the signature of what we have to battle for. I talk about this, by the way, with some frequency. I now do a podcast. I'm going to do my commercial now around the political world with John Rothmann. I tape something every morning, 5 days a week. It's posted. You can hear it.
Where do we find it?
You just go to John Rothmann, around the political world with John Rothmann. I did it last night. It came right up. So okay. What I try to do is to reflect on these things. And look, I know that what I say is sometimes controversial. I had people all over the country call me about persecution versus prosecution. But that's the way America is divided now. And when you ask these questions, the difference between Nixon and Trump, whatever you thought of Richard Nixon, he understood the American system.
Yeah.
He understood how America functioned. He knew in the end that he had done something terribly wrong. And okay, he sort of apologized for it. If you listen to the David Frost interviews, David Frost backed him into a corner, and he finally said, I impeached myself. I gave them the sword and they thrust it into me. I mean,
Yeah.
you can hear him say this, and you could hear not only the reality, but also the tragedy. Donald Trump doesn't admit anything, but history has to judge Donald Trump. And I'm going to tell you something. I believe he will judge harshly, very harshly. Now, let me point out before we conclude, we have the January 6th indictment coming down. John Smith is going to be in charge of that as well. I have on my desk, sitting right here, the January 6th committee report. Everybody should read it. And I can't wait to read Liz Cheney's book, which will be out shortly. We know that Georgia is going to be explosive because they've nailed him. There's no way Donald Trump can evade what is on tape. So here's the question. Does truth matter? Does it matter to the American people when we know the facts? And I'm going to tell you a fact. 1 and 1 equal 2. But if I tell you that 1 and 1 equal 3, I expect you to dispute that. And I expect Donald Trump will have his apologists, his defenders, but we have to state the truth. Yeah. And it's going to be very interesting these next few weeks as the Republicans have to respond to this, as Trump continues to respond to it. I can't wait, Kim. I wake up every morning regretting that I'm not on the radio 5 days a week.
I know.
Listeners calling in.
Well, I'll tell you that Mark Thompson is going to be filling in at KFI, and he may be taking a vacation. So I may be calling on you a little bit more, if that's okay.
Anything you want.
So
I
nice
am yours. This is so
nice.
important. And again, I want to emphasize, I am honored that you guys have asked me to be here. And I want to thank Mark for that. And I want you to know how pleased I am, Kim, that you are not just filling in, which is what you always said you did. No, you're more than a fill-in. You're a pro. And I don't just say that because you're my friend, but all of you can see the quality of the broadcast. And to Albert too. Yeah. What we're doing is so important. So again, if you want more, just go to Around the Political World with John Rothmann. You'll see they're all listed day by day, and you can listen. And I'm there every morning. They generally post it by 9 o'clock. And in the meantime, I can't wait to do whatever you need me to do. Kim,
okay, so last question for you.
Yes,
and I promise I won't keep you any more than this.
No, I don't. I have nowhere to go, nothing to do.
The last question is, have we ever, because what we're probably going to see, you mentioned the January 6th possible charges being filed, Georgia as well. This is only, the second indictment case coming down the pike. We could see more indictments.
There will be 4 total.
Yes.
At least 4 total, because you have the New York case, you have the case just done in the federal court, and 2 more.
That other indictments should be filed.
Right.
Is this the first presidential election where we will see one of the candidates in multiple court cases or involved in criminal cases?
Yes.
This is history making as well.
Yeah, this is history. And the tragedy is we probably won't have all the cases go to court. So Donald Trump will be able to run a campaign talking about how he is being persecuted. And I want you to bear in mind, he's not being persecuted, he's being prosecuted, and prosecuted with good reason. So but it is the first.
Usually you would think that's bad for a campaign. When you're in some trouble, that's bad for a campaign. Somehow he has this uncanny ability to turn it around and make it a good thing. And you know how they say any publicity is good publicity? Yeah. And so my fear is that all of these court cases will just feed into him and give him even more publicity and raise him up higher.
Okay, I don't think it'll raise him up higher. It's going to give him more publicity. Lindsey Graham, and if you have the sound, maybe Albert can find it. Lindsey Graham was asked today, I believe it was today, whether or not belief in Donald Trump is a cult, whether he belonged to a cult. And Lindsey Graham said, no, I've disagreed with them, and I've disagreed with them publicly. I'm not in a cult. Of course it's a cult. Of course it's a cult. Anything that Donald Trump says is viewed as legitimate. Well, what do you do when you confront that kind of situation? You expose it. You continue to drive home the points. And by the way, I will never, and listen to me carefully, I will never convince the absolutely diehard Trump supporters of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's not my goal. It is the broad middle of America that tries to do the right thing. That's who we have to reach out to as powerfully as we can. And the next presidential campaign, if Donald Trump is the nominee, which it appears he will be now, but who knows? We've got a long way to go before the convention.
Yeah.
Then that will be a major part of the campaign. But Kim, stop and think about it. We're not talking about the issues that confront the country. We're talking about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not the major issue that this country should be debating and discussing. And that's another problem. But we got to go after that middle.
Can you respond to this "What If" by Wes, who writes, if the governor of Georgia can pardon Trump, it doesn't matter what he's charged with in that state. So that kind of brings up that if he is charged or indicted or what have you in Georgia for, the election fraud, does the governor of Georgia just come out and go, you know what, done, we're not doing this? He's pardoned here.
Let me assure you that before a pardon can be issued in Georgia, this is not the case nationally, by the way. Nationally, if you want to give a pardon, there doesn't have to be any criminal intent. But if the governor of Georgia is going to issue a pardon, there would have to be a conviction first. And that's fine with me. I think, by the way, the thing that bothers me, aside from what's just happened, is the question of January 6th. Please, if you've never read the January 6th report, you can buy it in a bookstore. Yeah. I have both editions. Let me show you. I have this one, which is the January 6th report, which you can buy in any bookstore. And the cost of it, according to this, is
it marked and annotated? That's what I want to know. Have you annotated it all?
It's $19.99. Or if you prefer, you can call your member of Congress and you can get the exact same report, probably for free. And that is the final report of the January 6th committee.
Yeah.
It's the same document, but you can buy this. Read it, for heaven's sake, because the summary is absolutely amazing. And let me tell you, the summary is footnoted. I mean, I can show you a page. Look how that's footnoted.
Wow.
It's footnoted everywhere, and it's phenomenal.
That's some easy nighttime reading, is what that is.
Well, what it does is to keep us aware, informed, and knowledgeable. By the way, the summary of the report runs, here it is with the footnotes. With the footnotes, it runs about, I'll tell you exactly. It runs 193 pages.
Whew.
So, you may say, well, do I have time? It's worth it. And by the way, Liz Cheney has a book coming out. I have not seen the book yet, but I intend to get it as soon as it's available, which I understand will be in a couple of months.
Yeah.
I want to know what she thinks. And so this is really history happening. Yeah. And Kim, you and I are very lucky. We've been able to report the news and talk about the news. And now on the Mark Thompson program, we can interact again. And again, I want to remind people, Around the Political World with John Rothman, every morning, 5 days a week, it's posted.
Thank you, John Rothman, for joining us on the Mark Thompson Show. I adore you. And we'll see you hopefully very, very soon.
Yes. And will you please, again, congratulate your daughter? I saw your posting, and I follow her career avidly.
What?
Yes, for the eighth grade graduation. Wonderful. I will pass it on.
And she looked just so happy and so great. And you can give your son my best as well. He seems to be just fantastic as well. So anyway, thanks, Kim.
Thank you, John Rothman. All the best to your family too. Bye.
Bye.
John Rothman, everybody. Always so.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great.
Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.